So it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and former foreign correspondent for the New York Times, known for his work reporting from conflict zones like the Middle East and the Balkans. He holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and has also taught at several universities and within the New Jersey prison system. Hedges is the author of numerous books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and is a senior fellow at the Nation Institute. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Not at all. Yeah. So the death of American democracy has probably been the theme of most of the books that I've written over the last 2 decades. Books such as Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and the Triumph of Spectacle, Death of the Liberal Class, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which I did with the cartoonist Joe Sacco, Out of the Poorest Pockets of the United States, these places, sacrifice zones, places that capitalism has sacrificed. And of course, now they're sacrificing the entire planet. America, the Farewell Tour. So I've been hammering, and my book on the Christian right, American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. How did we get here? We got here through a kind of slow motion coup d'etat, where corporate forces seized all of the institutions, academia, the media. They set up, of course, their think tanks, but most importantly, the major political parties, Labour being a classic example in the UK, but the Democratic Party in the United States also. So what you saw was the infusion of corporate and oligarchic money into the political system until they owned it. And they do own it. And this corporate coup d'etat is over. It's complete. The political system is tangentially or fought tangentially around marginal issues, culture wars, but on the substantive issues, on war, on trade deals, on state surveillance, on austerity, on the consolidation of wealth by the oligarchic elite, there is absolutely no difference. And when a system seizes up like that, when it is deformed to essentially funnel money upwards, and this is what neoliberalism, the ideology of neoliberalism, is about. It never made any economic sense. Figures like Hayek and others who are the kind of the foundational forces for neoliberalism was never considered to be serious economists, but neoliberalism offered the justification for the stripping away of regulations, the destruction of monopolies, the consolidation of wealth into the hands of a global elite. And a part of this corporate coup d'etat was the shutting down of dissident voices in economic departments and everywhere else, and of course in the government, to follow this failed policy. It's never worked. It hasn't worked. It doesn't work now, but it doesn't matter. And when systems seize up, and I saw this when I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia, it vomits up these figures like in Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, Franjo Tudjman. In the United States, Trump, of course, Hungary, Orban, and then, of course, we're seeing the surge and Giorgia Meloni and others. I mean, these people are, kind of repurposed fascists, and the inability of the system, the longer the system cannot respond to the most pressing needs of the population, the more these demagogues, these cult-like figures, essentially gather a following. And I think you have to look at a figure like Trump as a cult leader when that then he makes sense. And in cults, as Margaret Singer points out in her book, cults in our midst. You want the cult leader to be omnipotent, to be completely powerful, because that is an expression of your own powerlessness. You endow your cult leader with total power, and it also, that cult leader is an expression of your own rage. And I would argue, certainly within the working class in the United States, that rage is legitimate. And so what we have been reduced to in the United States, well, and of course Tony Blair was your catalyst for this, in the way that Bill Clinton was our catalyst. And the difference between, let's say, a Trump and a Clinton or a Biden is that the Democratic Party will pay lip service to the pressing issues, including the climate crisis, but do nothing, or nothing that's of any substance or is any way meaningful. Whereas Trump is just, a figure like Trump is just naked in his calls to despoil and exploit. He's just opened up the reserves off of Alaska for drilling, so and national park land and everything else. So in terms of the crisis that we face, both in terms of the eco side, but also in terms of the consolidation of wealth into the hands of a global elite, has, in essence, ruptured the social bonds that knit hundreds of millions of people to their societies. And this, in my book, America, the Farewell Tour, I drew a lot on the work of the sociologist Emile Durkheim in his 1898 book, Suicide, where he asks the question, what is it that drives individuals or societies to commit acts of self-annihilation? And that's where you get the term anomie. And he talks about this breaking of the social bonds, that place within the society. It's no longer a meritocracy. You recognize that the future, your future, is stagnant or hopeless, but also the future of your children. And then Durkheim argues the response is to carry out self-destructive activity. He deals with suicide, but also addictions. It's interesting that one of my chapters is on a group called the Three Percenters in the United States. This is a far-right militia made up of veterans. And Durkheim talks about how groups or individuals that seek the annihilation of others are driven by longings for self-annihilation. And that kind of can be writ large within the system itself. And you see it now with the complete failure of the climate, the COP meeting, which is what's it been going, a week or something. It's done nothing and will do nothing. So how do the ruling global oligarchs compensate for that rupture of social bonds, that sense of meaning and belonging? Well, they create vast carceral systems. The United States has the largest prison system in the world. We are less than 5% of the world's population. We have over 25% of the world's prison population, and of course, militarized police and wholesale surveillance, and shutting down any kind of dissent. And you've seen that, of course, with Palestine Action and other groups. So what we're headed towards is this kind of dystopian world. I'm about to go to Italy to join the unions in the national strike in Genoa and Rome to attempt to halt arms shipments to Israel. And that's just a good example of how any return to an inclusive or a society that deals with justice and fairness, and most importantly, the rule of law, it's incumbent upon us. Of course, the ruling elites will issue all sorts of subterfuges to attempt to mollify us. This is what the classic liberal class does. but evidence is very clear that they will do nothing, not just in terms of the climate, but also in terms of the genocide in Gaza. I mean, they in the UK they recognize the Palestinian state. That is just a rhetorical kind of trick because they've only cut arms shipments to Israel by 10%. So, and Roger has long said this, and I've long been in agreement that if we are going to save ourselves from a very dystopian future, uh, and I think to go back to Gaza, one of the reasons I've been so involved in speaking up on behalf of the Palestinians is not only because I'm an Arabic speaker and I spent months of my life in Gaza and have lost friends there, and a lot of them have just frankly disappeared. We heard from them sporadically, and we don't hear from them anymore. But because that mechanism of that genocide, that wholesale use of industrial force on the Palestinians, and I think many in the global South have understood this, is not halted because it is the mechanism that, as the climate breaks down, will be used. I mean, the migrants who are fleeing to Europe, the migrants that are attempting to cross the border in Mexico, they are already experiencing the drones, the fences, the biometrics, the detention camps. That is, of course, being visited on the Palestinians. And of course this utter disregard for humanitarian and international law, and that's what's coming unless we stop it. And the only way we're going to stop it, as the unions in Italy know, is by shutting down the machine. The only pressure we have is collective, it's militant, nonviolent, but it is a general strike. It can cripple the commerce and the business of government in Italy, which is what they're attempting to do. It's why I'm going with Francesca Albanese and Yanis Varoufakis and Greta Thunberg. So that's what we have to do. We have to sever ourselves from the illusion that somehow these corrupt, corporate indentured political systems are going to do anything to protect us from the gravest crisis in human history, and of course not only for our species but for most all species.
Thank you so much, Chris. Are you okay if we go into some questions now?
Sure.
That was a great, great overview. Um, Except, also extremely depressing. Um, so you've spent decades reporting from some of the world's most violent conflict zones. How has witnessing war and authoritarianism abroad shaped your view of democracy in the United States?
Well, significantly, because I watched or I wrote and reported about disintegrating societies. So I know all the signs. I know how it works. Um, I also know how fragile the ecosystems of countries are. Covering, for instance, the war in Yugoslavia, I know what it feels like to have no electricity. We didn't have any electricity in Sarajevo. I had a generator, but we didn't have any electricity. I know what it looks like when the windows of all the shops are smashed and the shelves have been looted. I know what it looks like when the rule of law breaks down and armed militias or warlords take over. And that's something I saw not only in places like Sarajevo, but the Congo. So I think most people live in the illusion that the society that they inhabit is far more stable, permanent than it actually is. In fact, it can unravel very, very quickly. And when it does, it's very ugly. And I also know the nature of violence. It's why I'm so committed to nonviolence. Once you seek a political goal through armed struggle, then the people who have the arms take over. And that's almost never good. I think you can say it's never good. So I don't know that we're going to succeed, but I know that that's the only route to save us. And I know how fast, if seismic disruptions begin to take place, I know how fast things can unravel, and I know what it looks like.
Thank you. Um, just a quick reminder, if you have questions for Chris, please use the Q&A function at the bottom so that we can see the difference between comments in the chat and questions, because we'll come to those questions in just a bit. Chris, what scenarios do you see as possible in the next decade if these trends continue unchecked? Trends of increasing violence and increasing degradation of democracy?
Well, we're already seeing it. The building of climate fortresses. Much of the Israeli technology, especially in the case of drones and surveillance, is being used by countries like Greece, being used all along the border with Mexico. These sensors which come from Elbit and other Israeli firms. And let me just, by the way, say that I'm a strong admirer and supporter of Palestine action for this reason. So we know what it's going to look like, because for many people in the global South and for the Palestinians, it's what it already looks like. But all of those mechanisms, and it's not hypothetical. It's not that they will be turned on us. They already are being turned on us. So, for instance, when Sikh farmers were protesting, suddenly overhead are Israeli-built drones that are dropping tear gas and stun grenades on them. All of us are now incorporated into the system of the security and surveillance state through facial recognition and biometrics and everything else. And of course, because of our electronic devices, we're completely tracked. So we were already moving to that very Orwellian world when the government, which it can do, when the government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship between a master and a slave. So they're preparing and we're not. It's essentially what's happening. They know what's coming. They know within the next decade they're going to be dealing with probably hundreds of millions of desperate migrants. We know because, for instance, the U.S. military does all sorts of studies on the effects of the climate crisis, despite all the rhetoric. And they're preparing. They're already building the walls. They're already, cementing into place a system. I mean, of course, in the end, it's just a matter of time before everyone goes down. And the oligarchs are all buying former nuclear silos in Nevada and turning them into, kind of doomsday habitations, which is, I mean, the joke is on them, because I've lived in those societies that break down, and the only people who dominate are the people who use the guns, and the oligarchs. No one's safe. That world's already, it's visible around us.
Thank you. I'm going to actually jump straight into the questions in the Q&A section now, because we've had quite a few come through and they're really, really good. So the first one is, will the recent, I'm sure it's not a surprise for you to be asked about this, but will the recent New York City election result lead to Democrats running on a progressive platform, or will there be a pushback from the DNC given the results in other states? And I guess more broadly, what do you think are the political implications of Mamdani's win?
Well, the political implications are that the Democratic, that's not particularly revelatory, the Democratic Party base is disgusted with its leadership. So when Kamala Harris ran this vapid, issueless, celebrity driven campaign, 77% of registered Democrats wanted an arms embargo on Israel. Uh, and those roughly the same percentage want Medicare for all, which is universal health care. Well, so I mean, they're blocking our for-profit healthcare system is just a debacle. But of course, these corporate forces are trying to destroy the UK's universal healthcare system, just as they are in Canada. So it's all about these mercenary, predatory, exploitive forces are not only reducing us to the levels of serfs, but of draining us from what last bits of money we have, often through debt peonage. In terms of Mamdani, so Mamdani represents the aspirations of the Democratic base, but the reaction of the Democratic Party hierarchy has been hostile because they recognize that if they were forced to function as a real political party, i.e., the base had any kind of say in the issues, decisions, and leadership, they would be out of a job. And so they are uniting with the billionaire class, and New York City has the highest concentration of billionaires in the world. I believe it's the world, certainly in the United States, to destroy him. They will do everything they can to make his time in office to disrupt everything that he does. And I think you can go back and look to the last real anti-war candidate that we had at a national level. That was George McGovern in 1972. And when he managed, because they had opened up the Democratic Party to the base to essentially for nomination, the leadership of the Democratic Party united with the leadership of the Republican Party, which was running Nixon, to destroy their own candidate. And you'll see the same because these people, I think, are cognizant of the fact that if they weren't propped up and funded by corporate forces and oligarchs, they wouldn't be there. And so they've decided that even though all of their warnings about the danger of Trump's emerging authoritarian state are real, they have decided that they won't sacrifice their own positions to stop it. And they're not going to give up their first-class cabins on the Titanic, even as the ship goes down. So that's kind of the tragedy of where we are politically, and again gets back to the importance of movements, because Mamdani is going to be powerless unless, and very, very small percentage, less than 10% of the American workforce is unionized. Many of them are public sector employees, and they don't, under law, have the right to strike. So the one weapon we have, as the Italians are showing us, is the strike. And Mamdani would, in order to survive and push through his program, is going to need a base that is willing to push back to create a counter pressure to the forces that are already organizing to destroy him.
Thank you. Yeah. We've got a question here that is a little more, I guess, philosophical. So someone said, I've heard that the reason the US has descended so fast is that it is still a very young nation and has been fairly isolated and more powerful than its older peers. And they've said, as an analogy, it's like a teenager with lots of money but limited access to parents. Is that a fair analogy?
I mean, so the Rome, lasted about 1,000 years, but it only had 200 years at its height. I think our 200 years are up. And you have to remember that the United States is an empire. So I wouldn't look at the United States as a young nation. I would look at it as an empire and then draw those parallels between other empires, and all empires disintegrate, and all empires disintegrate in much the same way. One of the biggest being the military adventurism. So, what is it that essentially destroyed the British Empire's the suicidal folly of World War I? Yes, the British Empire had kind of slow disintegration, probably up until the 50s, but World War I killed it off. The United States has engaged in a series of military debacles, starting with Vietnam, 20 years in Iraq, and Afghanistan, and Syria, and Libya. And that is a point that historians often raise, that empires in the beginning are very judicious and careful about the use of military force, but in the end, as they face their decline and as their hegemony decreases, they begin to carry out military debacles in a desperate attempt to regain that lost hegemony. And that's where the United States is. Thucydides chronicles this in the Peloponnesian War with the death of Athenian democracy, which he blames on empire, because in order to run an empire, in ancient Greece, the demos, or the small city states, had autonomous power, not if you didn't hold property, and not if you were a slave, and not if you were a woman. So let's be clear. But they had a limited democracy in the same way that Israel had a democracy if you were Jewish. But in order to create an empire, you need centralized authority and centralized control. And so the autonomy that the demos, or the city-states, had, the city-states were called polis, the demos, or the population, the people. So the autonomy that they had was taken away from them. That's very true in the United States. And you build what people call the deep state, but whatever term you want, it is a powerful engine that is designed to perpetuate empire. So one of the interesting things that in my work is spending 2 decades on the outer reaches of empire. And let's remember that empire is the external expression of white supremacy. So on the outer reaches of empire, I saw not only the very racist language that has always been part of the DNA of any empire, the British Empire is no exception, French or anyone else, but also the tools. They perfected the tools of control, wholesale surveillance, militarized police, drones, all that stuff was used on the outer reaches of empire first, before migrating back to the homeland. And Thucydides notes precisely the same thing, where he said the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So I wouldn't look at the United States as a young nation. I think 200 years tends to be the maximum span of any empire, and ours is up, it's over. I would look at it as an empire in decline.
That's really fascinating. Someone has said in the Q&A section, how can non-US residents help those in the USA to set up and help the pro-democracy slash assembly slash revolutionary movement over there? I think this is a recurring question that we're asking, as people who citizens in a globalized system, that we're seeing atrocities and in Palestine as well. How can we help? How can we support?
Well, by targeting those businesses and institutions that are vital to the maintenance of empire, we can put Elbit Systems up at the list. And you've seen the response. You've seen what they've done to the Palestine action. I think some are still on hunger strike. Is that correct? So this is nonviolent action, which is what in a functioning democracy should be protected. And it's nonviolent action that is attempting to stop a genocide, which, there's been a complete inversion where those who perpetuate the genocide at the highest levels of government in the UK and the United States are war criminals. They are accomplices in the crime of crimes. And those who use their democratic methods to attempt to halt that genocide have been criminalized, and not just in terms of action, but also in terms of speech. So I'm sure it's true in the UK, but in the United States, police were brought on campuses to shut down encampments. Students were put on probation, expelled, suspended, professors as well, including a few friends of mine, because they were attempting to. Really, these encampments functioned as the nation's conscience, and between the closure of those encampments and a concerted effort in the spring of 2024, all of these universities met in confabs, often with Israeli linked security firms, to essentially abolish free speech on college campuses, on university campuses. I mean, you can't even flyer. The SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, gets banned, et cetera, et cetera. And a good friend of mine, Rashid Halili, who's the great historian on Palestine, he can't even teach. He said, I can't teach. He teaches a survey course every fall on the Middle East. He said, I can't teach it. He did, because the kinds of things that I would say under the new rules would see the university carry out disciplinary action against me. So he's not even teaching it. And that's, of course, many of these people have been purged. One of our great constitutional law scholars, Catherine Franke, was pushed out of Columbia Law School after 25 years because she also decried what was happening at Columbia. So there's been a concerted effort, and this has also been true with climate activists, as we've seen in the UK. There's a concerted effort to essentially quash any kind of democratic dissent. I think that I have nothing to teach activists in the UK. I was there frequently for Julian Assange. They were great, and Palestine Action is great. We as Americans have to begin to replicate that. And unfortunately, we haven't yet. Italy, countries like Italy are far ahead of us. We have to begin to replicate that kind of organized resistance if we're going to save ourselves. But that's our job. I mean, I think, it's obviously united front. We're obviously all targeting the same systems of oppression. But those systems of oppression are hardly unique to the United States. They exist in every single. I mean, look at Germany. Germany, especially on the issue of Palestine, Germany has just become appalling. I mean, it's actually become almost, in a very dark way, farcical, where you have the grandchildren of Nazis arresting Jews for decrying the genocide. I mean, that's Germany for you. So, and all of these figures like Starmer and others. I mean, Starmer represents that failed, bankrupt liberal class. They're holding on by their fingertips because they stand for nothing. They fight for nothing. They're all, bastard children of Tony Blair, one of the most reprehensible politicians the UK, and the UK's had a few of them. And the whole idea that Blair is going to go off to Gaza and be a viceroy. I mean, these people just live in a kind of a fantasy island, but they're dangerous.
Yeah. There's another question in the chat, which is how are immigration, race, and gender being used differently in the US compared to Europe to create fear in the public? So on this idea of scapegoats. And I think the question is asking how are different communities being scapegoated differently depending on the historical context of the UK and of the US and Europe that are different.
Well, there's many similarities. So, I mean, of course, the scapegoating in the UK is directed at Muslims. In the United States, it is also directed at Muslims, but it's heavily directed at our largest migrant class, which are Hispanic, which you don't have. And it's directed at Blacks. So, but yes, any despotic government seeks to inculcate fear within the society by demonizing a particular group to justify more authoritarian control. So you had the characterization of these encampments, and I was in the encampments in Columbia and Princeton. I live in Princeton, so they were right up the street. The idea that these people, I mean, first about 20 or 30% of them were Jewish. The idea that this were bastions of Hamas or anti-Semitism was ridiculous. But this even preceded the encampment. So I went to Harvard. The idea that Harvard or Princeton, where I've taught, or Columbia, where I've also taught, were incubators of anti-Semitism is ridiculous. But they acquiesced to this false narrative from the beginning, the university administrations, which essentially they handed the gun to their own executioners. And when the students encampments and the media was very culpable in this false portrayal, this false narrative, including the New York Times. So that suddenly that false narrative of huge problems with anti-Semitism on college campuses then was used to justify all of the draconian forms, including, I mean, over 100 students at Columbia were arrested. Students were beaten at universities when the university administrators allowed police onto the campus for, let's be clear, nonviolent protests. So that false narrative was used to shut down the universities. Shutting down universities is very, very dangerous. I know because I've covered all sorts of dictatorships because that's the place where you incubate ideas. That's the place where dialogue should be free. That's the place where radical ideas should be discussed and embraced. I mean, so shutting down universities is a very, very, and that's what's happened. So, but it was based on a false narrative. Then you saw the demonization of migrants, that they're criminals and Honduras is emptying its jails, which again is false. Most of the migrants in the United States have a much lower crime rate, by the way, than white Americans statistically. So most of them are working 12 hours a day for $15,000 a year or something. They're exceedingly hardworking. That justifies the creation of ICE, these goons, these paramilitary, and we've seen them on our streets seizing people who are legal residents, the beatings, shootings, even rappelling into apartment buildings from helicopters. Well, that's you're creating your version of the brown shirts. But it was, again, this false narrative. Then we saw with the assassination of this horrible racist, Charlie Kirk, I mean, misogynist, Islamophobe, homophobe. Anyway, any criticism of this guy, I mean, he was immediately deified, turned into a martyr. And that was used to create the fiction of the radical left, which is out to kill us, in the words of Trump. And they must be shut down. So you have all of these false narratives that are used by, and this is typical in an authoritarian regime, all of these groups that are scapegoated to essentially consolidate authoritarian control. And that's what we've been witnessing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I think we'll go for there's a couple more questions in the chat in the Q&A box. And then we'll do about 10 minutes more of questions and then wrap up. So there are two questions which are similar but slightly inverted. So one is, how do we get through the seriousness of the crises that we face to the mass populations in Europe and the US? And the other one is, how can we compel governments to listen to the will of the people? So, well, how do we cut through?
We can't compel these systems to listen to us because, as I think I mentioned before, if these systems actually listen to us, they wouldn't exist, and they know it. So we're not going to advance either the rule of law or the creation of a sustainable world by appealing in any way to these systems. That's what they want us to do, but it's wasted energy. And if you want them to react, you have to make them frightened. Politics is a game of fear, and the only power we have is collective. We do have that power, but they've worked very, very hard to strip us of it. So appealing to the system is absolutely useless, and don't do it. All of our work should go into organizing movements that have the capacity to disrupt the system. That's where all of our energy has to go. And what was the other question? Or did I answer both of them?
It was how do we cut through to the mass populations of Europe and the US rather than governments?
Oh, education, education, education. And that's long and tedious. I mean, so I covered the uh, insurgency in Guatemala in the 1980s. The most effective rebel movement, the ORPA, which was 90% indigenous and was led by the son of Guatemala's Nobel Prize winning writer, Asturias, spent 2 years going village to village in the highlands, uh, running seminars about the nature of oligarchy and capitalism. And before they got a rebel movement off the ground. Yes, it was armed, but you in a country like Guatemala, especially after the 1954 Arbenz coup, they didn't really give people a choice. I've been when I covered the war in Sarajevo. It's societies when they break down, and the oppressor begins to use indiscriminate violence, counter violence, which of course is what's been happening in Gaza. Counter violence is the only way to fight off annihilation. I don't like it. I mean, violence corrupts everyone, even those people who are defending themselves, as I saw in Sarajevo. But anyway, it took 2 years, and that was the most successful of the four rebel movements, probably in Guatemala, and that's what launched what we call the silent genocide in Guatemala. And Carter had actually President Carter had cut off military aid in 1977, and so the country that filled the void was Israel. So Israel sent hundreds of military advisors, and they in Spanish they called it the Palestinization of the highlands, where they destroyed 600 villages, and we don't know the full number. I mean, tens of thousands of people were murdered, but it was really copied on the 1948 Nakba quite openly. And the rifle that the Guatemalan army used was the Israeli Galil. So the only way they could break that rebel movement, because the indigenous base had been uh, uh, educated, is the right word, had a kind of consciousness, was to destroy the infrastructure by which the rebel movement sustained itself. And, one of the horrible lessons of Guatemala is that genocide works. It did destroy the movement. And that's what they've done in Gaza. I mean, 90% of the buildings in Gaza don't exist. There's no clean water. It's just been rendered, the graveyard that all concentration camps are. That's all it is now. So, education, and that's that, in the highs and lows of American or European consumer culture, we want flash mobs, we want quick hits, we want adrenaline rushes. That's not going to work. It's tedious, it's slow, it's often one-on-one, but all of the great radicals of the turn of the century understood this, both in the UK and the United States. If you read the memoirs of these great labor activists, they're working 10 hours a day in a sweatshop, and then they're going off to their Yiddish study groups at night. And labor, also successful labor movements, are well aware that a key component of any labor organizing is education. So that's absolutely fundamental. So we aren't going to we're not going to bring a kind of consciousness to the masses quickly. It's often done in small groups. It often has to be done one-on-one, but that's essential because once people become conscious of systems of oppression, they become dangerous because they know how those systems work, and they can't be played by them. I mean, it's one of the reasons I teach in a prison, because here are our most oppressed, and uh, uh, and it's why the prison system is so hostile to the. I mean, I teach at the college level because when these people become aware of the nature of institutional racism, the nature of capitalism, the nature of empire, they understand why militarized police carry out reigns of terror in their cities. So it's education.
Thank you. I think we've got time maybe for one more question. And there are some good ones, but I'm just gonna have to pick. Just gonna have to pick. Be ruthless. So someone's asked, with the oligarchy becoming all the more present, are we as opponents better off than we were 20 years ago?
No, no, because the democratic space is closed and the institutions by which our voices could be heard and have atrophied even more. So no, no. I mean, look, Aristotle summed it up. He said that when he used the word aristocracy, but when you have oligarchic control, the only two choices are tyranny or revolution. We can do another one. That was a quick answer.
That's good. Okay. Um, so this is a little bit of a technical one. In regard to the idea of empire, it can be argued that recent empires have been able to come into being because of energy. E.g., the British Empire was built on scaling the use of oil, and the same with the US on, oh, sorry, the British Empire was built on scaling the use of coal, and the same with the US on oil. What role does energy and resources have on the creation and stabilization of empire?
Well, the British Empire was also built on oil. That was Churchill when he switched in the First World War from coal to oil and realized that he needed the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. That was a British project. So, yeah, I mean, the empires are completely dependent on fossil fuel. So, I mean, that, of course, is one of the problems. I mean, I can't imagine the emissions coming out of Gaza right now with their, 100 and those D9 Caterpillar helicopters. I can't remember how heavy they are. They're like beasts. I've seen them. They're gigantic. They're not like normal bulldozers. I didn't mean helicopters. They're so uh, the by challenging our addiction to fossil fuel, you are challenging one of the foundations of empire without question. Yeah, which is why they're so hostile to us. One of the reasons they're hostile to us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think
I'm so happy to do it. Yeah, not at all.
we'll wrap it up there. Honestly, that was fantastic. I've just seen Annie has put in the chat 32 million tons of carbon emissions in Gaza recorded.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah. And I think she also put something in above about the hunger strikers in the UK. So check that out.
All right. Well, do your, I mean, Palestine actions where we have to go, shutting down the M25 motorway is where we have to go. And the state is unforgiving. So it is incumbent on all of us to carry out, not just verbally, but physically, acts of solidarity with these courageous people who are trying to save not just our democracy, but our planet.
Yeah. There are a few things you said that I noted down that stood out for me. You just said it again then. It's incumbent on all of us to restore justice. And the only pressure we have is collective, militant, and nonviolent, which I thought was just a brilliant mantra that sums it up perfectly. And all of our energy should go into building movements that have the capacity to disrupt the system. We don't get anywhere by appealing to the oligarchs that govern us. So yeah, thank you, Chris. That was
not at all. Thanks for doing
an incredibly detailed and informative discussion.